They told me gold had no conscience, but they were wrong. Gold remembers everything. The hands that forged it, the vaults that hid it, the silence that followed its theft. And in the final days of Berlin, when the sky burned and the earth trembled under Soviet artillery, I stole a piece of that gold, not for power, not for greed, but because my wife's name had just appeared on a deportation list, and I had less than 72 hours to buy her life back. My name is Erich Vogt, and for 12 years I worked as a senior ledger clerk at the Reichsbank. To the outside world, I was a quiet man in a grey suit, balancing columns of figures while empires collapsed around me. I never shouted at rallies. I never wore a party pin. I simply kept the numbers straight while the world went mad. But inside those vaults beneath Wilhelmstrasse, I had seen the true anatomy of the Reich, not in tanks or speeches, but in bars of gold stamped with the eagles of conquered nations, in crates of foreign currency looted from occupied capitals, in the cold arithmetic of plunder disguised as policy. I never carried a weapon, I never gave an order. But by April 1945, I knew more about the Nazi treasury than most generals, and that knowledge, I would soon learn, was both a death sentence and a lifeline. The city was already half buried. Soviet shells fell like metronomes, steady and merciless. Food had vanished weeks earlier, now even hope was rationed. My wife, Lena, was Jewish, though we hidden it for years behind forged papers and a marriage certificate signed in 1938 before the laws turned cruel. For a time, it worked. She taught piano to officers' children. I kept my head down. We survived by becoming invisible, by mastering the art of silence. But in late March, a neighbor, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of spite, reported her. The Gestapo came not with shouts, but with quiet efficiency. They didn't arrest her, not yet. They left a note slipped under our door. Your file has been reopened. Present yourself at Prince Albrechtstrasse by Friday. That was Tuesday. I knew what that meant. By Friday, she'd be on a train east, or worse, already gone. Unless I could prove she was indispensable, or unless I could make someone forget she existed. And in the final days of the Third Reich, the only currency that still bought mercy was gold. That night, I walked through the ruins to the Reichsbank. The building still stood, though its windows were shattered and its grand entrance blocked by sandbags. Inside, chaos reigned. Senior officials had fled to Bavaria or Austria, taking their families and their secrets. Junior clerks burned documents in oil drums, their faces lit by the orange glow of flames that consumed years of ledgers, correspondence, and evidence. But the vaults, those deep steel-lined chambers beneath the basement, remained sealed, guarded by two exhausted SS men who hadn't slept in days and who barely glanced at my credentials. They knew the war was over. They just hadn't told Berlin yet. I had access, not to everything, but enough. My clearance allowed me to audit outgoing transfers, and in the confusion of evacuation orders, no one was checking who signed what. I waited until midnight, when the last truck carrying Reichsbank archives rumbled out toward Berchtesgaden. Then, using a key I'd copied months earlier, just in case, a habit born of paranoia, I entered Sub-Vault C, where smaller reserves were kept for emergency diplomatic use. There, stacked in wooden crates lined with felt, were hundreds of gold bars, each weighing a kilogram, each marked with a serial number and the Reichsadler. The air was cold, dry, silent. So silent I could hear my own pulse echoing off the steel walls. I took 3. Not because I wanted more, but because I knew one bar might vanish into a bureaucrat's pocket, 2 might raise suspicion, but 3 could buy a new identity, a train ticket to Switzerland, and silence. I wrapped them in oilcloth, tucked them into a leather satchel meant for ledgers, and walked out past the guards, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they'd hear it. But they didn't. They were staring at the eastern horizon, where the sky glowed red with the fires of Neukölln, as if watching the funeral pyre of the Reich. I went home through streets littered with broken glass and abandoned bicycles. A stray dog followed me for 2 blocks, then vanished into a crater. Lena was awake, sitting by the window with a suitcase already packed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were waiting for a train that might never come. She didn't ask what was in the bag. She only asked softly, "Will it be enough?" I didn't answer, because in that moment I realized the terrible truth. It wasn't just her life I was buying. It was my soul, and I had no idea how much that would cost. By dawn, the first Soviet tanks had reached the S-Bahn ring, and by noon I would meet a man in a ruined pharmacy near Potsdamer Platz, a former Swiss diplomat named Klaus Rügg, who'd stayed behind when his embassy closed, and who now dealt in passports, penicillin, and people. He'd told me once, over a shared cigarette in the winter of 1943, "If you ever need to disappear, bring something the victors will still want." Now I had it, heavy, cold, glowing with the stolen wealth of a dying empire, and I was about to trade it for the only thing that still mattered. But before I left, I stood in our apartment one last time, listening to the distant thunder of artillery. On the piano sat the sheet music for Schumann's Träumerei, Lena's favorite. She hadn't played in weeks. The silence of that piano hurt more than any explosion. I thought of all the things we'd lost, our neighbors, our routines, the simple luxury of walking down the street without fear. And I wondered whether survival was worth the price of becoming a thief in the eyes of history. Yet what choice did I have? The state that once demanded obedience now offered only oblivion. If morality couldn't save her, perhaps theft could. As I stepped into the street, the air smelled of wet ash and burnt rubber. A child's doll lay in the gutter, one arm missing. Somewhere, a radio still played a crackling waltz from another era. Berlin was dying, but it hadn't stopped pretending to live, and neither would I. I adjusted the satchel on my shoulder, the weight of it pulling me forward like a secret I could no longer carry alone. Ahead, through the smoke and rubble, Potsdamer Platz waited, and with it, the first real test of whether gold could truly buy a second chance. Or if some debts could never be paid, because in the end, I wasn't stealing from the Reich, I was stealing back a future it had tried to erase, and that, I told myself, made all the difference. I remembered the first time I saw Lena play that Schumann piece. It was 1936, in a small salon in Charlottenburg. She wore a blue dress with white lace at the collar, and her fingers moved across the keys like they were remembering a dream. Afterward, she told me music was the only place where time stood still. Now in 1945, time had collapsed entirely. Past, present, and future were all buried under the same rubble, and yet, as I walked toward Potsdamer Platz, I clung to that memory, not as comfort, but as proof that something beautiful had once existed here, and might exist again if we could just reach the other side of this nightmare. The pharmacy was little more than a shell. Its windows were gone, its shelves overturned, but the green cross above the door still hung crookedly, like a promise. Inside, Klaus was waiting, wrapped in a long coat despite the spring chill, his face gaunt but his eyes sharp. He didn't greet me. He simply nodded toward a back room where a single kerosene lamp flickered. "You brought it?" he asked. I opened the satchel just enough for him to see the oilcloth bundle. He exhaled slowly, as if relieved and disappointed at once. 3 bars, he said. "That's more than enough, but remember, once this is done, you don't exist. Not to me, not to anyone. You vanish, or you die trying." I told him Lena would be with me. He hesitated. 2 people double the risk. "She's not optional," I said. He studied me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Love. The one currency even gold can't outshine. We agreed to meet at the Lehrter Bahnhof in 2 nights. He'd have papers, tickets, and a route through the American lines. All I had to do was survive until then. As I walked back through the ruins, the weight in my satchel felt different, not heavier but more real. It was no longer just metal. It was hope. It was guilt. It was the price of a life in a world that had stopped valuing them. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe we might escape this city alive. But Berlin had other plans. That evening, as I turned onto our street, I saw smoke rising from our building. My heart stopped. I ran. The front door was splintered open. Inside, everything was overturned. Drawers emptied, books torn, the piano overturned. But Lena was gone. No note, nobody. Just silence. I stood in the wreckage, the satchel still on my shoulder, and for the first time I screamed, not in anger, but in pure, animal terror. Had they taken her already? Was it too late? Then from the cellar, a soft knock. I rushed down the stairs. There she was, hidden behind a false wall we'd built months ago, her face pale but calm. "I heard boots on the stairs," she whispered. I didn't know if they'd come back. We held each other in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of our old life. And in that moment I knew the gold wasn't enough. Not anymore. Now I would need luck, courage, and a miracle, because the war wasn't over, not for us. The night after they ransacked our apartment, I didn't sleep. I sat in the cellar with Lena, the satchel resting between us like a third presence, its weight both a promise and a curse. Outside, the shelling had grown erratic, sometimes distant, sometimes so close the walls trembled and dust rained from the ceiling. Lena held my hand, her fingers cold but steady, and for hours we said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Words had failed us long ago. Now only action mattered. And in 2 nights at Lehrter Bahnhof, action would decide whether we lived or vanished into the final ledger of the Reich's dead. I had met Klaus Rög 3 years earlier, in the winter of 1942, when I was sent to the Swiss embassy to verify a suspicious transfer of francs linked to a Dutch textile firm. He was then a mid-level financial attaché, precise, reserved, fluent in 4 languages, and famously indifferent to ideology. "Money flows," he once told me over bitter coffee in his office, "but people drown in it." Even then, I sensed he saw the war not as a clash of nations, but as a vast, chaotic marketplace where loyalty was just another commodity. When Switzerland closed its Berlin mission in January 1945, most diplomats left. Klaus stayed. Officially, he was winding down affairs. Unofficially, he became something else entirely, a ghost broker in a city of ghosts. I returned to the ruined pharmacy at noon the next day, this time with Lena hidden beneath a shawl, her face smudged with soot to dull her features. Klaus was waiting, standing behind what remained of the counter, sorting vials of morphine and iodine like a man preparing for a surgery he knew would fail. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "You brought the pianist," he said, not unkindly. Lena didn't flinch. She simply nodded. Klaus turned to me. "The Americans are tightening the cordon west of the Spree. We'll have to go through the Tiergarten, risky, but quieter. I've secured 2 seats on a freight train, leaving Lehrter at 0317. It's carrying medical supplies to Hanover, but it stops in Helmstedt, just inside the British zone. From there, a truck will take you to Göttingen, then to Basel by foot if necessary." "And the papers?" I asked. He pulled 2 brown folders from his coat. "Swiss nationals. Ernst and Margarete Huber, teachers from Bern. You'll need to memorize their birthdays, their children's names, their favorite cheeses. 1 slip and you're finished." He paused, then added, "The British are thorough. The Americans are tired. Play it right, and they'll wave you through like everyone else, running from the Russians." I opened my satchel and placed the oilcloth bundle on the counter. Klaus unwrapped it slowly, revealing the 3 gold bars, their surfaces dull but unmistakable. He ran a thumb over the Reichsadler stamped into the metal, then weighed one in his palm. "This is Reichsbank issue. Traced, probably. But gold is gold, even when it's cursed." He rewrapped it carefully and tucked it into a false-bottomed medical case. "I'll move it tonight. By morning it'll be in Zurich. By next week it'll be someone else's problem." Lena spoke for the first time. "What if they catch you?" Klaus smiled faintly. "Then I'll tell them I found it in the rubble." Berlin is full of treasures no one claims. He looked at us both, his expression softening. You understand this isn't charity. I do this because the world needs more people who steal to save, not to conquer. But don't mistake me for a hero. I'm just a man who knows the price of silence. We left before dusk, taking separate routes back to the cellar. The city felt different now, not just broken, but watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a soldier, every window a pair of eyes. I kept my head down, the satchel empty but still heavy with consequence. That night, we rehearsed our new identities until our real names felt like costumes we'd outgrown. Lena practiced her Swiss German, softening her Berlin vowels. I memorized the Huber's address on Seelergraben, the name of their parish priest the year they married. We were becoming ghosts before we'd even left. The next day, our last in Berlin, was eerily quiet. The shelling stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At noon, a rumor spread through the ruins. Hitler was dead. Some wept, others laughed. Most just stared into space, as if the news had drained the last drop of meaning from the war. I felt nothing. Not relief, not joy. Just a hollow certainty that his death changed nothing for us. The machinery of destruction would keep turning until someone turned off the power. And that someone wasn't us. That evening, I went to say goodbye to the only friend I had left, Herr Neumann, the old bookseller on Friedrichstrasse, whose shop had been reduced to a single shelf leaning against a wall. He pressed a small volume into my hands, Goethe's Elective Affinities. For the journey, he said. Stories are lighter than gold, but they last longer. I wanted to tell him everything, but I didn't. Some secrets are too heavy to share, even with friends. Back in the cellar, Lena was packing our final bag, 2 changes of clothes. The Goethe book, a photograph of her mother, and a small vial of morphine Klaus had given us, for pain, he'd said, or for peace, if it comes to that. We didn't speak of the vial. We didn't need to. At 010 a.m., we left the cellar for the last time. The streets were empty, lit only by the occasional flare drifting down from the sky like dying stars. We moved quickly, silently, hugging the shadows. When we reached Lehrter Bahnhof, it was a skeleton of its former self. Roof gone, platforms cracked, tracks twisted like broken bones. But amid the wreckage, a single freight train idled, its engine hissing steam into the cold air. Near the third car, a figure in a railway cap stood waiting. Klaus. He handed us 2 tickets and a map. The conductor knows you're coming. Don't speak to anyone else. Stay in your compartment. And whatever you do, don't look back. He turned to Lena. You play piano. She nodded. Then remember this. Music doesn't need a country. It only needs someone to listen. Then he was gone, melting into the smoke and darkness. We boarded. The compartment was narrow, lined with crates marked, medical supplies, do not open. The conductor, a gaunt man with tired eyes, barely glanced at our papers. He simply pointed to a bench and said, 3 hours to Helmstedt. Don't make noise. The train lurched forward, and Berlin began to recede behind us, not with a bang, but with a whisper. For the first time in years, I felt something like hope. But hope, I had learned, is the most dangerous currency of all. Because just as the train crossed the Spree, a Soviet patrol appeared on the bridge ahead, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. The engine slowed. My heart stopped. Lena gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. The conductor stepped out, speaking calmly in Russian. There was a pause, then shouting, then silence. The train moved again. We didn't speak until dawn. When the first light touched the fields of Brandenburg, Lena whispered, Do you think we'll ever play that Schumann piece again? I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman I'd married, but the woman I'd fought to keep alive. Yes, I said, and this time I'll listen. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. We were not free. Not yet. Freedom wasn't a border or a train ticket. It was the moment you stopped looking over your shoulder. And that moment, I feared, was still far ahead, because gold buys passage. But it doesn't buy peace, and somewhere behind us, in the ruins of a dying capital, the Reich's stolen wealth was already changing hands again, waiting for the next desperate soul willing to trade their conscience for a chance to survive. The train rolled through the Brandenburg countryside as dawn bled into the sky, pale and uncertain, like a promise made too soon. Outside, the fields were empty. No farmers, no livestock, only the occasional burned-out tank or abandoned wagon resting in the mud like relics of a forgotten war. Inside our compartment, silence reigned, thick and watchful. Lena sat with her eyes closed, but I knew she wasn't sleeping. She was listening, just as I was, to every creak of the rails, every shift in the engine's rhythm, every distant echo that might signal danger. We had crossed into the unknown, and in that liminal space between Berlin and the British zone, even breathing felt like a risk. For hours, we said nothing. There was no need. Our silence had become its own language, forged in years of hiding, of coded glances, of words left unspoken to protect each other. Now that silence was our armor. When the train slowed at a junction near Oranienburg, we both tensed. A group of German soldiers, ragged, hollow-eyed, their uniforms more patch than fabric, boarded the next car. They didn't look at us. They didn't look at anything. They simply collapsed onto the floor and slept like men who had already died but hadn't yet stopped moving. I watched them through the slats in the crate wall, wondering if they knew the war was over or if they were just too tired to care. By mid-morning, the landscape began to change. The forests grew denser, the villages smaller, the roads less scarred. We were moving west, toward the zones held by the Western Allies, where order still meant something, where a forged passport might actually be believed. But hope, I had learned, is a fragile thing in wartime. It flickers brightest just before it's extinguished. At 11:47 a.m., the train stopped abruptly in the middle of a pine forest. No station, no signal, just trees and silence. The conductor appeared at our door, his face grim. "British patrol ahead," he whispered. "They're inspecting every carriage. Stay calm. Say nothing unless spoken to." He handed us 2 cups of lukewarm tea, real tea, not the ersatz bark we'd grown used to, and vanished. 10 minutes later, boots clattered on the platform. 2 British soldiers entered, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces young but weary. One was tall, with red hair and a Scottish accent. The other shorter, with a notebook already open. They glanced at our papers, then at us. "Swiss, eh?" the Scot said, flipping through our documents. "You're a long way from the Alps." "We're teachers," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're returning home after caring for my wife's sick mother in Potsdam." He raised an eyebrow. "Potsdam? That's been shelled to bits." "She passed last week," Lena added softly, her Swiss-German flawless. "We only stayed to bury her." The shorter soldier scribbled something in his notebook. "And this train? You know it's carrying medical supplies for displaced persons?" "We were told it was the only way out," I replied. "The roads are full of soldiers. And worse." The Scot studied us for a long moment. And then to my surprise he smiled. "Aye, well, nobody should have to bury their mother in a war zone." He handed back the papers. "Move along then. And welcome to the British sector." Just like that we were through. I didn't breathe again until the train pulled away, the pines swallowing the soldiers behind us. Lena leaned her head on my shoulder, her body trembling slightly. Not from fear, from relief so profound it felt like grief. We had crossed the first real threshold. But thresholds, I knew, are never just lines on a map. They're tests of who you become on the other side. At Helmstedt, the train emptied quickly. Refugees, soldiers, civilians, all streaming toward a makeshift checkpoint where British officers handed out bread, water, and questionnaires. Klaus's contact, a man named Dieter with a limp and a British Army armband, was waiting near a red postal van. He didn't greet us. He simply nodded and said, "The truck is around back. Keep your heads down." The van smelled of diesel and damp wool. Inside, 2 other passengers huddled in the corner. A Polish woman clutching a child, and an elderly man with a bandaged hand. No one spoke. We drove for hours through winding country roads, avoiding main highways, stopping only once to let a column of British tanks pass. The sun set behind us, painting the sky in shades of rust and violet. For the first time in years I noticed beauty, and that scared me more than any checkpoint. We arrived in Göttingen after midnight. The town was quiet, its medieval spires untouched by bombs, as if the war had politely stepped around it. Dieter led us to a boarding house run by a widow named Frau Becker, who took one look at our papers and said, "Upstairs, second door. Breakfast at 7. Don't make noise," as she didn't ask questions. In 1945, everyone had secrets. Asking was bad manners. That night, in a narrow room with thin walls and a single window overlooking a garden, Lena finally broke down. Not with sobs, but with quiet, shuddering breaths that shook her whole body. I held her until she slept, my own eyes wide open, listening to the unfamiliar sound of crickets and distant church bells. No artillery, no sirens. Just peace, so strange it felt like another kind of danger. The next morning, over weak coffee and stale bread, Frau Becker handed us train tickets to Basel. "Klaus sent word," she said, not looking up from her knitting. "The border's open for Swiss nationals, but be quick, the Americans are starting to screen more carefully." She paused, then added, "And if anyone asks, you've been here 3 days. Not 1 minute less, we left at noon." The train to Basel was clean, orderly, almost absurdly normal. People read newspapers. Children played with wooden toys. Her conductor checked tickets with a polite smile. It felt like stepping into a dream, or a memory of the world, before everything broke. But as we crossed into Switzerland, something shifted inside me. Not relief, not joy, a deeper, colder realization. We had escaped the Reich, but we hadn't escaped what we'd done to survive. The gold was gone, but its weight remained in my conscience, in my dreams. In the way I now saw every stranger as either a threat or a potential buyer of silence. In Basel, we checked into a small hotel near the Rhine. That evening, Lena walked to a music shop and bought a second-hand piano tuner. She didn't play, not yet, but she sat beside the upright in our room, running her fingers over the keys like she was relearning a language she'd almost forgotten. I stood by the window, watching the river flow, steady, indifferent, eternal. Somewhere behind us, Berlin was burning itself to ash. Somewhere ahead, a new life waited. But here, in this quiet room, suspended between past and future, I finally understood the true cost of what I'd done. I hadn't just stolen gold. I had stolen a future. And futures, unlike gold, cannot be returned. So I made a decision that night, one I've never spoken of until now. I would never tell anyone what I'd done. Not the Swiss authorities, not our new neighbors, not even our children, if we were lucky enough to have them. The truth would stay buried, like so much else from that war. Because some silences aren't cowardice, they're mercy, for Lena, for myself, for the world that needed to believe people like us were simply survivors, not thieves, not conspirators, not moral compromises wrapped in grey suits. The next morning, we went to the civil registry and became Ernst and Margaret Huber in full. We opened a small music school. Lena taught piano. I kept the books, and for 50 years, I said nothing, but gold remembers, and so do I. Basel in 1945 was a city of polished cobblestones, quiet courtyards, and clocks that kept perfect time. Everything Berlin was not. Here the war existed only in newspapers, and the occasional refugee with haunted eyes. We arrived in late May, 2 Swiss teachers with impeccable papers, and a story so ordinary it barely warranted a second glance. That was the genius of Klaus's plan, not to hide us as fugitives, but to dissolve us into the fabric of everyday life. And for a while, it worked. We rented a small apartment above a bookbinder's shop on St. Elben-Vorstadt, a narrow street that ran parallel to the Rhine. The room smelled of glue and old paper, and from the window we could see the river flowing steadily toward Germany, as if carrying away everything we'd left behind. Lena insisted on placing the piano by the window where the morning light could fall across the keys. She didn't play at first, not for weeks. She simply sat beside it, tuning each string with meticulous care, as if restoring not an instrument, but a part of herself that had gone silent. I found work keeping ledgers for a local music publisher. It was familiar, safe, and required no questions. My German was fluent, my Swiss accent passable after weeks of practice, and my demeanor, quiet, precise, unobtrusive, raised no suspicion. To our neighbors, we were just another couple rebuilding after the chaos of war. No one asked why we never spoke of our past in Bern. No one wondered why we avoided newsreels or why Lena flinched at the sound of distant thunder. In Switzerland, discretion was not just polite, it was expected. But silence, I soon learned, is not the absence of sound. It is a presence. It lives in the space between words, in the way you hesitate before answering a simple question, in the dreams that wake you at 3 a.m., with your heart pounding and your hands clutching sheets like they're the only thing keeping you from falling back into the past. I began to measure time not in days or months, but in near misses. The postal clerk who squinted at our return address, the school inspector who asked too casually about our teaching credentials in Bern, the neighbor who mentioned a cousin in the Swiss Federal Archives. Each one sent a jolt through me, a cold reminder that our new life was built on sand. Lena adapted better than I did. She threw herself into teaching, her students, mostly children of diplomats and bankers, adoring her gentle patience and perfect pitch. She never spoke of her past students in Berlin, the ones whose parents had worn swastikas on their lapels while their children learned Mozart. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I'd see her pause mid-lesson, her fingers hovering over the keys, her eyes distant, as if listening to a melody only she could hear. I never asked what she was remembering. Some silences are meant to be honored, not broken. We never spoke of the gold. Not once, not even in whispers behind closed doors. It was as if we'd agreed, without words, that to name it would make it real again, and reality was something we could no longer afford. Instead, we built rituals of normalcy. Sunday, walks along the Rhine, coffee at the Marktplatz Café, evenings reading by lamplight. We even attended church on Christmas Eve, not out of faith, but because it was what ordinary people did. And for a time, we almost believed we were ordinary. But the past has a way of circling back. It happened in the spring of 1947. I was at the post office when I saw a newspaper headline. Reichsbank gold recovered in Zurich. Swiss authorities investigate. My blood turned to ice. I bought the paper with trembling hands and read every word in a nearby alley, my breath coming in short gasps. The article described how 3 gold bars, stamped with Reichsbank serial numbers, had been traced to a private account linked to a former Swiss diplomat in Berlin. His name wasn't mentioned, but I knew. It was Klaus. I didn't tell Lena that night. I couldn't. Instead, I lay awake, listening to her steady breathing, wondering if this was the end. Had Klaus talked? Had he been arrested? Was someone now following the trail from Zurich to Basel, from Klaus to us? For weeks, I watched every stranger on our street, every unfamiliar car parked too long near our building. But nothing happened. The story faded from the papers. Life went on, years passed. We adopted a daughter, Anna, in 1951, after a local orphanage learned of Lena's work with children. She was 4 years old, with dark curls and a laugh that filled our apartment like music. The moment I held her, something in me softened, not because I forgot what I'd done, but because I finally understood why I'd done it. It wasn't just for Lena. It was for this, for the chance to raise a child in a world where names weren't erased, where music wasn't silenced, where gold didn't decide who lived and who died. Anna called me Papa from the first day. She never questioned why we had no family photos from before the war, why we never visited Bern, why I sometimes stared at the river for hours without speaking. To her, we were simply her parents, loving, quiet, a little old-fashioned. And in her eyes, I found a kind of absolution I hadn't known I needed. But absolution is not the same as innocence. In 1965, on the 20th anniversary of the war's end, a documentary aired on Swiss television about Nazi gold and the banks that laundered it. Lena turned it off halfway through. "We don't need to watch that," she said softly. But that night, for the first time in years, she played Schumann's Träumerei. The notes floated through the apartment, fragile and beautiful, and when she finished, she turned to me and said, "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" I didn't answer immediately. Outside, the Rhine flowed on, indifferent to guilt, to justice, to the weight of stolen gold. Finally, I said, "We saved a life. Isn't that always right?" She didn't reply, but she took my hand, and we sat in silence, the kind that doesn't hurt but heals. Still, the truth remained buried inside me, growing heavier with each passing year. I watched Anna grow into a brilliant, compassionate woman. I saw her marry, have children of her own. And with every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary moment of joy, the lie between us grew larger, not because I regretted saving Lena, but because I knew that one day someone might uncover the truth and see not a rescuer, but a thief. In 1989, Klaus died. I read his obituary in a Geneva paper, just a few lines about a retired diplomat who served with distinction. No mention of Berlin, no mention of gold. Just silence, and in that silence I felt a strange kinship with him. We had both chosen to disappear, not into shadows, but into the quiet dignity of ordinary lives. By the 1990s, historians were digging deeper into Nazi assets, and Switzerland faced mounting pressure to reveal what it had hidden. I followed the news with a mix of dread and detachment. The world wanted accountability. But accountability, I knew, is a luxury for those who survived with clean hands. Mine were not clean. They never would be. And yet here we were, still together, still safe, still silent, because in the end I didn't steal gold to become a hero. I stole it to become a husband, a father, a man who could look his daughter in the eyes and say, "You are safe," and mean it. That, I told myself, was worth any silence, even this one. I never intended to tell this story. For 50 years, I believed silence was the price of peace, not just for me, but for Lena, for Anna, for the grandchildren who called me Opa, and knew me only as a quiet man who loved classical music and kept perfect time on his pocket watch. But in 1995, everything changed. Not because I was discovered, not because someone threatened to expose me, but because I saw a photograph in a history book, a black and white image of the Reichsbank vaults in 1945, and there, in the corner, half obscured by shadow, was a crate stamped with the same serial number as the gold I'd stolen. In that moment I realized the truth wasn't buried. It was waiting, and if I didn't tell it myself, it would be told for me, distorted, sensationalized, stripped of its humanity. Lena had passed 2 years earlier, peacefully in her sleep, with her hand in mine, and Schumann playing softly on the radio. She never asked me to keep the secret after she was gone, but she never asked me to break it either. So I waited. I watched the world change. The Berlin Wall fell, archives opened, survivors spoke. And slowly I began to understand that silence, once an act of protection, had become a kind of erasure, not of guilt, but of context, of the impossible choices ordinary people made in extraordinary darkness. I decided to write it all down, not for publication, not for fame, but for Anna, so that if the truth ever surfaced, she would hear it from me, not from a journalist, not from a historian, but from the father who loved her enough to lie, and then to finally tell the truth. I began on a cold January morning in 1996, sitting at the same desk where I'd once balanced ledgers for the Reichsbank, then for a Swiss music publisher, then for our little school. The pen felt heavier than I remembered. The first sentence took an hour. They told me gold had no conscience, but they were wrong. From there, the words came like a flood held back for decades. I wrote about Berlin in ruins, about the note under the door, about the weight of 3 gold bars in a leather satchel. I wrote about Klaus, about the train to Helmstedt, about the silence of Basel, and I wrote about Lena, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a woman who played piano in the dark because it was the only way she knew how to stay alive. When I finished, I sealed the pages in an envelope and gave them to Anna. She read them in one night. The next morning she came to me with red eyes and said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted you to love me for who I was," I said, "not for what I did." She hugged me then, not as a daughter judging a father, but as a human being recognizing another's pain. "You didn't steal gold," she whispered. "You stole time, and you gave it to us." Her words didn't absolve me. Nothing ever could. But they gave me something just as rare, understanding. In 1998, a Swiss parliamentary commission released its final report on Nazi gold. It confirmed that hundreds of bars had vanished in the war's final days, some likely smuggled out by desperate civilians, not just officials. The report didn't name me. It didn't need to. But for the first time, the world acknowledged that not all who handled that gold were monsters. Some were just people, terrified, loving, willing to do the unthinkable to save someone they loved. That same year, I donated our piano to a music school in Zurich. Before they took it away, Anna sat down and played Träumerei one last time. The notes filled the room like a benediction. When she finished, she turned to me and said, "She would have wanted you to speak now." I knew she was right, so I contacted a historian at the University of Basel, not to confess, but to contribute. I gave him my testimony, my documents, my memories. I asked only that my name be withheld until after my death. He agreed. And in 2001, a footnote appeared in a scholarly volume on wartime finance. One anonymous source, a former Reichsbank clerk, described smuggling gold to save his Jewish wife, a reminder that moral clarity is often a luxury of hindsight. I never saw the book in print, but knowing it existed was enough. I am 92 years old now. My hands shake, my eyes grow dim, but my memory is sharp, too sharp sometimes. I still dream of Berlin, of the smell of ash, of the silence in our cellar. But I also dream of Basel mornings, of Anna's laughter, of Lena's fingers on the piano keys. And in those dreams, I am not a thief. I am not a hero. I'm simply a man who loved someone more than he loved his own soul. I tell this story now, not for forgiveness, but for witness. Because history is not just made by generals and politicians. It is made by clerks, by nurses, by teachers, by people who stand in the ruins of a broken world and choose, in that moment, to do something small and desperate and human. And sometimes that small thing is enough to save a life, or a future, or a song. Gold may remember everything, but people remember selectively, and I hope, when they remember me, they remember not the theft, but the reason for it, because in the end, we are not defined by the worst thing we've done. We are defined by who we tried to save, and I saved her, not with a speech, but with 3 bars of stolen gold and 50 years of silence. Now, the silence is broken, and I am finally free.